The temple no longer breathed with life. Its tall corridors, once humming with voices and soft footsteps, stood still under Coruscant's pale twilight. Wind stirred through cracked stone, where once younglings laughed and masters taught. The banners of the Order had fallen, stained and torn, drifting against the cold walls like ghosts. Shadows clung to corners where light had once danced freely, and in the silence that followed the purge, the Force, once radiant and warm here, now felt distant, veiled in sorrow. Ahsoka stood at the edge of the temple's outer hall. The steps behind her bore the weight of old memories. She did not cry. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, but within her a quiet storm brewed. She had walked away before. She had left the Order when trust had been shattered and the ground beneath her beliefs cracked apart. But back then, the temple had still stood proud. Back then, there had still been time. Now, all that remained was wreckage, physical, spiritual, moral. Her choice to leave had once felt like a rebellion. Now, it felt like survival. Ash scattered at her feet, carried by wind that whispered the names of those no longer here. Names she would never forget. Names that still echoed when she closed her eyes. The floor beneath her boots bore scorch marks, the remnants of blaster fire, lightsaber wounds too, slashed in arcs of betrayal. There had been no mercy that day. Clone troopers turned against Jedi without hesitation. Orders passed down from a face behind a mask, and so the temple, once a sanctuary, became a tomb. She hadn't been here when it happened. The Force had pulled her away long before the trap was sprung. Some might call that fate. Others might call it abandonment. She didn't know what to call it yet, only that she was still breathing. And that fact, alone, demanded purpose. The galaxy had changed while she had walked in silence. Systems fell, empires rose. Whispers of rebellion moved like shadows under Durasteel, and through it all, Ahsoka kept moving, never lingering, never anchoring. She kept her sabers hidden and her voice low. She became Fulcrum, a ghost in the machine, a voice in the dark, always watching, always listening. But today, she had returned to where it began, not to mourn, not to reclaim, to remember. She stepped further in, walking past collapsed pillars and hollow chambers. She traced her fingers along the wall, feeling the grooves etched by time and war. There were no illusions left. The temple no longer held safety, nor guidance. It was a carcass, but even in ruin, it whispered truths. She stopped at the meditation chamber. The door had been blown apart, its frame melted and twisted. Inside, a single bench remained, half sunken into rubble. This was where she used to sit, legs crossed, breathing in rhythm with the Force. It had been peaceful once. She remembered Anakin's voice, stern, protective, proud. She remembered his training, his strength, his downfall. She lowered herself gently to the broken bench. Dust clouded the air, golden under the faint light. Her hands rested on her knees. She closed her eyes, and she listened. Not to the sounds of the temple. They were gone. She listened to what lay beneath them. The flow, the current, the Force, still moving, still living. It had always been there. But the Jedi in their height had grown deaf to its warnings. They had politicized wisdom, institutionalized instinct, and the cost was everything. She breathed deeply, and with that breath came clarity, not in words, but in presence, in sensation. She was still connected, still alive. Not a Jedi, not a soldier, something else. The Force did not speak with words, but it nudged, it stirred feelings, and in that silence it showed her paths not yet taken, unseen futures, hidden dangers, distant stars. Her time among the Jedi was over, but her journey was not. Standing once more, she stepped over the rubble and moved toward the heart of the temple, what remained of it. Here, the archives had once stood tall, endless data stretching across pillars of light. Now they were scorched black. The knowledge that survived had been hidden, smuggled out by desperate hands. What hadn't been stolen was erased. Yet beneath the stone, ancient holocrons still pulsed. Quiet blue and red flickers beneath broken tile. She felt them, fragments of wisdom still clinging to the Force. Not all was lost. Not yet. She knelt and touched the floor. "Thank you," she whispered. To the temple, to the past, to her younger self who had believed, and the woman who had walked away when belief was no longer enough. Then she rose and turned toward the exit. Her cloak caught the wind. Her silhouette passed through the shattered doors like a passing thought. She did not look back. There was no need. The stars beyond Coruscant shimmered faintly. Somewhere, war still raged. Somewhere, lives still depended on choices yet made. And in the silence of her own resolve, Ahsoka stepped forward into the unknown once more. She would not call herself a Jedi, but she would stand when others fell, speak when others were silenced, and act when others hid. Not for titles, not for legacy, but because someone had to, and because the Force still moved through her, not as command, but as quiet guidance. A river she now walked beside, not through. The temple behind her grew smaller, the future ahead, unwritten. And so the ashes settled. The silence returned, but she did not. She moved onward, alone, but not lost. Its world stretched out in silence, worn thin by centuries of war and neglect. Dust clung to everything. Even the wind seemed tired. Ahsoka passed through these forgotten places like a shadow. She never stayed long. She worked quietly, spoke less, and paid attention to the patterns others missed. She slept in abandoned buildings, storage units, cargo holds. Now and then, she found work repairing systems too old for droids, or fixing comm arrays on isolated moons. Most didn't care who she was, and those who did never said it aloud. Her Montrals were hidden beneath a cowl. Her lightsabers were buried far from reach. The name Jedi never passed her lips. What the Empire crushed with brute force, Ahsoka learned to outlast through patience. She watched stormtroopers parade through villages where mothers rationed water and children walked barefoot. She saw governors installed by decree, mining colonies taxed into collapse, and traditions outlawed with signatures on data pads. She learned not to interfere unless it mattered. Not every cruelty could be stopped, but sometimes, in the right moment, she could change something small. A transport rerouted, a prisoner vanished from records, a shipment of food redirected. No flags, no medals, just motion in the background. In the silence of her solitude, she sharpened new instincts. Jedi training taught her control. Exile taught her discretion. There were others who noticed her movements, though few knew her name. Refugees spoke of a woman who fixed their comm units and left in the night. Smugglers told tales of an informant with no face who always knew which planets to avoid. In remote systems, people whispered stories about someone who helped from the shadows. She became a rumor. One evening under the violet skies of Rada, Ahsoka sat on a crate in a marketplace that had once thrived. The Empire had taken its fields. Laborers now worked under military command, pushing harvest quotas while soldiers guarded silos with loaded rifles. She watched as a child handed over a ration chip for half a loaf of bread. Her hands curled at her sides. But she didn't act. Not yet. Not here. That night, she buried her frustration in the soft dirt behind an empty farmhouse and waited. Days later, when the food shipment vanished and the transport carrying it exploded 3 systems away, no one linked the two. Small actions, quiet resistance. Over time, she gathered names: traders, farmers, former Republic officers hiding in plain sight. None of them coordinated, none of them organized, but they were willing. They listened, they remembered, and in time, they trusted. Ahsoka gave them code names, simple signals, secure frequencies. She left messages buried in static across long-range comms, encoded in patterns only former military personnel would notice. She trained them to recognize safe routes, hidden caches, and weak points in patrol schedules. She never gave more than necessary. Each cell worked independently. No names, no faces. That way, if one fell, the others would stand. This was where Fulcrum was born. The name meant nothing. That was the point. It became a signal, not a person. A silent presence within the emerging networks of rebellion. Fulcrum provided intel, coordination, timing. No one knew who it was. Some thought it was a protocol unit. Others believed it was an old Republic spy master. Ahsoka let the myths grow. They served her well. She began reaching out to senators who had grown wary. Bail Organa was one of the first to answer. Their contact was sparse at first. Brief transmissions, coded and indirect. Bail understood discretion. He understood risk. Through him, Ahsoka learned of scattered resistance across the core. And through her, Bail received updates from far-flung outposts, where the Empire's reach faltered. Her network expanded, slowly, carefully, never too fast. Trust was fragile, and exposure fatal. She walked through cities under curfew, watching parents teach their children to stay silent in the presence of stormtroopers. She saw prisoners loaded into transports without trial, saw artists forced into labor camps for painting murals deemed subversive. She heard stories of Jedi survivors hunted down by inquisitors, masked agents wielding twisted versions of lightsabers. When she heard those names, she said nothing, but her resolve deepened. There were times she came close to discovery. Once, on Archeon, she found herself cornered in a processing facility after sabotaging a droid relay tower. The stormtroopers were fast, but she was faster. She used no lightsaber, just timing, shadows, surprise. When the dust cleared, they remembered only confusion and a damaged security feed. She carried guilt with her, always. For the friends she could not save, for Anakin, for the Order's downfall. But she did not let it consume her. Guilt, like grief, had to be managed, not erased, not indulged. It lived in the silence between her movements, in the stillness between missions. On some worlds, they began to leave signs for her, scratches on door frames, marks in the dirt, a thread tied to a gatepost, signs she taught them, signals that meant, we are here, we are listening, we are ready. She left signs of her own in return, empty canteens left full, instructions hidden in grain sacks, quiet gifts for those who dared to resist. Fulcrum wasn't a symbol. It was a current, moving beneath the surface, invisible, but shaping everything it touched. And when the whispers of rebellion grew stronger, when Mon Mothma spoke in secret, and rebel cells began to speak to one another, Fulcrum's voice guided them softly from behind every encrypted message. Ahsoka remained out of sight, but always near, watching, advising, preparing. The Force no longer roared in her ears as it once did. It hummed gently now, like a river far away, still flowing, and Ahsoka, walking along its banks, kept listening. The galaxy did not erupt into rebellion. It cracked quietly. Ahsoka stood on the edges of it, never centered, always peripheral. She did not claim control. She did not demand loyalty. What she offered was knowledge, measured, purposeful, trusted. And in the deep undercurrents of a growing resistance, her voice traveled in fragments, not declarations. Her name was never spoken aloud. Only Fulcrum. Always Fulcrum. Meetings were never held in the same place twice. The first was on a freighter drifting above Onderon's upper orbit. It was dark, poorly pressurized, with flickering lights and cracked metal that moaned softly under strain. There were no seats, no formality, just 5 people standing in a loose circle, eyes wary, voices low. Some had fought in the Clone Wars. Some had lost families under the Empire's tightening grip. Each had their reasons. Each knew the cost. Ahsoka remained hooded. She spoke with restraint, precise. Her tone offered neither inspiration nor command. It offered clarity. She explained how to intercept comm relays without detection, where patrol routes were vulnerable, which officers accepted bribes. She passed along data chips encoded in fading hutties, instructions wrapped in innocuous star maps. No one asked who she really was. None dared. Trust in those early days was earned in slivers, a dropped warning that saved a convoy, a tip that kept a senator from capture, a plan delivered in advance that turned an ambush into a victory. Her reach extended not through authority, but through consistency. She always knew just enough. She always appeared before disaster struck. She mentored the first cells like one tending fires that must burn low and steady. Too bright, and they would draw the eye of the Empire. Too cold, and they would extinguish. She taught restraint, not recklessness. Precision, not panic. It frustrated some. There were younger rebels who wanted open battles, public defiance, flames in the sky. Ahsoka warned against it. She had seen too many pyres already. Each cell operated in silence. Some sabotaged fuel lines on military routes. Others rerouted Imperial shipments to desperate colonies. A few focused solely on smuggling families out of danger. Their actions were uncoordinated at first, accidental in their synergy. But beneath it all, Fulcrum whispered, advising, connecting, shifting their efforts towards something larger, something structured, something that could last. She operated from the shadows of forgotten systems, sometimes from mining tunnels carved beneath cold moons, sometimes from hollowed-out freighters disguised as merchant vessels. In her solitude, she built pathways between voices that would otherwise never meet. Bail Organa became a quiet ally. His influence helped shelter entire operations. Mon Mothma, in time, would come to trust the voice behind the encrypted messages, but even they knew little of Fulcrum's true face. The more the cells succeeded, the more the Empire noticed. Imperial Security Bureau agents began cross-referencing sabotage incidents. Data points were flagged, patterns surfaced, stormtroopers were rerouted. Still, Ahsoka kept ahead of them. Her messages changed frequency every day. Her drops were buried inside junk signals or wrapped in false orders. She never repeated a method twice, and when the Empire caught one cell, it never led to another. That was her discipline. That was her design. She trained others to listen for signals in noise, to track patrols not by movement but by absence, to find silence where there should be sound. Those were the spaces rebellion thrived. The Empire spoke in loud threats and endless parades. Ahsoka taught her people to speak through absence, through subtle changes, through presence unannounced. Over time, some began to suspect Fulcrum was not one person, that no single mind could predict so much. A deliberate myth, encouraged by her silence. The name grew beyond her. It became a mantle, one that others would carry after her, reshaped by different hands and voices. But in these early years, it was hers alone. She rarely made direct contact, only when it was absolutely necessary. One such meeting occurred on Arcanis, in the back room of a spice den long since condemned. She spoke with a former Imperial officer who had grown disillusioned with what he called the tightening noose. She told him where his experience could help, how he could train others, and then she vanished before dawn. The man never saw her again, but weeks later, his efforts rerouted entire shipments meant for tie production. Her sabers remained hidden, not from fear, from choice. The Force had not abandoned her, but it whispered now instead of calling. It moved in suggestion, not command. She followed where it led, sensing when to speak and when to vanish. There were nights she watched cities from high ridges, listening to curfews declared through megaphones and cries muffled in alleyways. She knew they were not ready for open war, but she also knew the Empire feared one thing more than defiance: coordination. The quiet unification of voices once scattered, that was what Fulcrum enabled. She kept a holomap in a storage compartment aboard a rusting freighter she rarely called home. It was outdated, filled with notes scratched into the frame, circles drawn in faded ink, systems where cells operated, systems where they'd fallen. It was not a map of territory. It was a record of potential, of fragile hope-forming constellations. When transmissions reached her bearing news of successful raids, safe extractions, intercepted orders, she said nothing. She simply adjusted her map. A new star marked, a new whisper made real. And when a cell failed, when silence meant discovery and discovery meant death, she mourned in her own way. A small stone placed in the corner of the cockpit. No names, just a marker, a promise to remember. The rebellion was not yet a rebellion, not truly, but it breathed now, in hushed voices, in blinking lights beneath false panels, in the rhythmic hum of stolen generators running one more night. And Ahsoka, still alone, still unknown, continued her work, quiet, steady, unseen, but always moving. Malachor was buried in silence. The planet's surface cracked like ancient bone, blackened and brittle under a sky too still. Lightning flickered without thunder. The wind hissed low through stone, whispering warnings older than memory. Nothing lived here. Nothing dared. Ahsoka stepped onto the ashen plain with caution, her boots sinking into dust untouched for centuries. The shuttle hissed behind her, cooling slowly as it powered down. She had come following fragments, scattered pieces of legend, a coded map, and a pull in the Force she couldn't ignore. Malachor wasn't on most charts. It had been hidden, sealed, like a wound no one wanted to touch. But she had to see it. The whispers around the name had grown louder. The Sith had built here once, a temple carved into the planet's crust, long before the Jedi even understood how deep the darkness could go. What remained was not ruins. It was a grave. The ground felt hungry. The Force here twisted unnaturally, slow and dense, like oil dragging through water. She pressed forward, flanked by Ezra and Kanan. The air thickened the deeper they walked. Lightning lit distant towers, spires of jagged stone that clawed at the dead sky. They entered the temple through a wound in the rock. The hallway sloped downward, cold, endless. Inside, carvings lined the walls, grotesque depictions of ancient wars, of beings bound in chains of fire and shadow. None of it felt metaphorical. The Sith didn't deal in metaphor. Every symbol, every detail, spoke of power taken and suffering inflicted. Ahsoka said little. She let the Force guide her steps. Deeper into the darkness they found it. The battleground. the place where the Jedi and Sith had clashed in ancient days. Statues stood frozen in final poses, some shattered, some burned. Others melted into the stone as if trying to escape their fate. Blades of energy were still locked in combat, frozen mid-swing. An entire war caught in stillness. They were not alone. The presence hit her like a cold wind through the spine. Ezra noticed it too. Kanan stiffened, his hand tightening near his saber. Something was watching them, something old. But the sensation wasn't just dark, it was familiar. And then he came. The hallway trembled under the weight of his steps. A shadow moved through the temple with slow purpose, metal scraped stone. Breath rasped through a mechanical rhythm, steady, unhurried. Vader emerged from the shadows like a figure stepped out of nightmare, black armor, cloak trailing like smoke, face masked by silence. He didn't rush. He never did. His presence filled the space, colder than the Sith relics around them. Ahsoka stood still. She didn't speak. The truth was already unraveling inside her, thread by thread. She had suspected, felt it before. But seeing him here, now, in the heart of a place so broken, it cut deeper than any blade. She stepped forward. Ezra called out, but she didn't stop. Her saber hissed to life, white, clear, steady. "I won't leave you," she said. Vader didn't answer immediately. His head tilted slightly. Then his voice came, mechanical, hollow, familiar in its distortion. "Then you will die." She didn't flinch. The clash was fast, brutal. Ahsoka moved like a whisper, striking clean and precise. Vader countered with weight and efficiency. No wasted motion. Sparks lit the chamber as blades met. Ezra and Kanan moved, but the room separated them, stone crashing down in bursts of force-fueled fury. It became her duel alone. She circled him, testing. He responded with aggression, forcing her back. She tried to reach him, not with words, but with presence. She reached through the force, tried to touch something beneath the armor. There was nothing there. Only fragments, echoes, faint and fading. She struck hard, forcing him to stagger. Part of his mask cracked, revealing one eye. Just one. It was not the eye of a stranger. It was Anakin. Flesh, scorched. But the eye, blue, human, haunted. "Anakin," she whispered. The eye narrowed. "Anakin is gone. Number I won't believe that." The force trembled between them. For a moment time slowed, the air stilled. She saw the boy he'd been, the man he became, and the monster he now embodied. She saw them all at once, and for a moment so did he. Then he raised his saber. She knew he meant to kill her, not to test, not to threaten, to end her. The structure collapsed further. Ezra shouted from somewhere above. The temple cracked from the strain of ancient energy reawakening. Sith holocrons stirred with unstable power. A burst of force split the floor. Ahsoka saw the opening. She could leave. She could escape. She didn't. She turned back to Vader and lunged. Their blades met one final time. Dust swallowed the chamber. Ezra escaped. Kanan escaped. Ahsoka vanished. No body, no signal, no trace, only echoes. And the voice. That voice, deep, mechanical, cold, carried through the dust. A whisper, not words, just presence. Vader walked from the temple alone. Some said she died, others weren't sure. Fulcrum went silent for a long time. Messages ceased. The network went quiet. Cells operated without guidance, relying on what she'd taught them. But some believed she still moved, somewhere beyond reach. Not dead, not lost. Watching, waiting, a different kind of ghost. There was no ground beneath her, no sky above, only the hum of something vast and ancient vibrating through the emptiness. Ahsoka opened her eyes slowly. The last thing she remembered was Malachor, dust, pain, and the final clash. Now she stood weightless in a space unlike anything she had ever touched with the Force. It was not light, it was not darkness. It was motion without time. She turned slowly. A path stretched out before her, black, narrow, floating in the void. Arches soared overhead like ribs of some sleeping giant, shimmering with energy that pulsed in and out of phase. Between them, doors flickered like dying stars. They opened into places not yet real or already long forgotten. She didn't understand what this place was, but the Force vibrated around her with reverence, like it too paused in recognition. She stepped forward. Each footfall echoed, though there were no walls. Whispers drifted across the space, familiar voices, unfamiliar ones. Some had been dead for centuries, some had not yet lived. Her own voice appeared at intervals, captured from moments in the past. Words she had spoken, words she hadn't yet. The sensation was disorienting, not painful, not peaceful, just unmoored. The world between worlds. That was the name Ezra would later call it. A place outside the rules of space and time. Not a location, a convergence. She didn't find Ezra, he found her. A portal opened beside her path. She saw herself, locked in combat with Vader, seconds before the fatal blow. And then, a hand reached through the portal and pulled her free. She stumbled into the corridor, breathing hard, heart racing. Ezra stood before her, younger, uncertain, eyes wide with fear and wonder. He had saved her, but not truly, not fully, not without consequence. The Force trembled around them. They walked together in silence. Ezra asked questions. She answered what she could. She didn't pretend to understand the place, but she felt its weight, its structure. Every step they took reverberated across possibility. Pull one thread, and another might snap. They paused before another portal. Through it, Ezra saw Kanan, his master, his guide, moments before death. Ezra's hand lifted. Ahsoka stopped him. "If you save him," she said gently, "you all die." It wasn't cruelty. It was balance. This place was not meant for rewrites. It was a canvas, not a pen. To change too much would destroy everything held together beyond the veil. Ezra lowered his hand. The portal faded. Ahsoka said little afterward, but she watched him closely. He understood now. He felt the burden of knowing more than one lifetime was supposed to, and with that came silence. They parted eventually. Ezra would return to Lothal. His fight was still ahead. Hers too, but different now. She stood alone again beneath the arches. The world between worlds stretched on in all directions, looping, infinite. Ahsoka turned slowly, listening to the flow of energy beneath her feet. The Force here didn't speak through emotion or instinct. It spoke through patterns, through harmony and disturbance. She realized here that the Force was not only personal, it was environmental, structural, woven into existence like rhythm into music. She heard Anakin's voice in one direction, Yoda's laughter in another. She heard herself, older, wiser, in moments yet to be. Not visions, not illusions, echoes, not meant to be followed, just felt. Choice mattered, not because it changed the past, but because it shaped the present. It shaped her. She remembered her training. The Jedi had once taught that the Force willed the future, but here she saw that the future was never fixed. It flowed from 1,000 points of view. It responded to presence, to clarity, to truth. And she understood something new. She was not here by accident. Her survival on Malachor, her removal from that fatal moment, it wasn't escape. It was repositioning. Her life had not been spared. It had been reassigned. Purpose lingered in the air. A portal opened again, not to a place she knew, but to a time that waited, a presence beyond the edge of the map. Ahsoka stepped toward it, but this time she did not rush. Before passing through, she turned back toward the endless path behind her. She closed her eyes, and she thanked it, not with words, but through calm. Then she moved forward. The world between worlds faded behind her. Its weight remained. She awoke on a new world, not in body, but in understanding. Her path now lay elsewhere, far beyond the broken remnants of Malachor, beyond the reach of the Empire's gaze. She did not speak of the place to many, only those who needed to know, only those ready to hear. The world between worlds was not meant to be a weapon. It was a lesson, a lens. The Force had once been her shield, her strength, her answer. Now it became her question. Not all paths were lit, not all doors opened. But in that strange corridor outside of time, Ahsoka had learned the most important truth of all. She was not here to restore the past. She was here to guide the future, and the future was already listening. Ahsoka stood beneath an alien sky streaked with blue suns, listening to silence. The ground beneath her was smooth, ancient, etched with spirals and lines that meant nothing to most, and everything to those who remembered. The wind was light, but it carried weight, the kind that came from long-forgotten stories still clinging to stone. This world had no name in modern maps. It had once been known among Jedi explorers, recorded only in passing, a footnote in a long-expired archive. Ahsoka had found the coordinates scratched into a rusted Jedi relic buried in the sands of Lamu. One of the last scavengers there had sold it, thinking it junk. It wasn't. She followed the stars here without fanfare. No trail of witnesses, no chatter on comms. The planet welcomed her not with revelation, but with stillness. And in that stillness, she found clarity. The temple wasn't like the others. There were no statues of robed warriors, no great doors that opened to command. The structure had been carved into a cliffside, grown into the rock as though it had sprouted from the Force itself. It didn't dominate the landscape, it surrendered to it. She crossed the threshold alone. There were no guardians, no traps, just hallways lined with soft light pulsing from stone veins, and inscriptions in languages long stripped from galactic memory. The air smelled faintly of dust and moss. She didn't come to find power. She came to listen. At the center of the structure, a chamber opened into a circular space. Pillars stood in quiet vigil, their surfaces smooth with age. In the middle lay a disc-shaped altar carved with a spiral, the same symbol she had traced with her fingers on the outer walls. The spiral repeated across the temple, always beginning and always folding inward. Not a symbol of endings, a symbol of reflection. She sat cross-legged on the floor, palms on her knees, eyes half closed. The Force was strong here, not overwhelming, not wild. It flowed in slow rhythm, as though the planet itself was breathing. It filled the walls, passed through her skin, touched the edges of her thoughts. It was different than she had felt among the Jedi. Less instructive, more curious. Less of a doctrine, more of a dialogue. The temple began to show her things. Not visions, not hallucinations, moments. She saw Jedi from forgotten centuries, kneeling in the same spot, heads bowed, not in power, in humility. One by one they faded, warriors, scholars, diplomats, each having walked their path, each having listened before speaking. The Force was not their weapon, it was their companion. Ahsoka had been trained in the halls of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, where discipline and doctrine had shaped the foundation of every lesson. But those walls had fallen, and here, surrounded by a place untouched by war, she saw what the Order had forgotten. The Force wasn't only structure, it was story, woven from pain, growth, compassion, conflict, and silence. There were artifacts within the temple, but none bore weapons. No sabers, no shields, only scrolls sealed in cases of organic glass, tablets etched in slow, patient hand. Ahsoka spent hours with them, days perhaps. Time no longer tracked cleanly here. The inscriptions did not shout wisdom. They asked questions. What does power mean when detached from purpose? How can one serve if one does not listen? Can peace exist without understanding? Ahsoka sat with each one until the questions no longer lingered as words but resonated in her bones. She found a map, incomplete, etched into the underside of a clay basin left near a faded mural. The stars depicted weren't known to her. Some might not exist anymore. But the paths it suggested were old Jedi pilgrimage routes, journeys taken by early initiates, not to train, but to unlearn. These weren't paths of conquest. They were meditative circuits, built to expose Jedi to worlds beyond power, beyond politics. The Council had stopped encouraging such paths generations ago. That mattered. It wasn't resentment she felt, not anger, just clarity. The Jedi had grown too structured, too certain. The galaxy had changed around them, and they had not listened. Ahsoka rose slowly, tracing the path on the basin with one finger, committing it to memory. She would not follow it blindly, but its intention mattered. Movement guided by curiosity, by presence. Before leaving the temple, she returned to the central chamber. The light had shifted. A beam from the ceiling now fell directly onto the spiral at the center. She stepped onto it. The Force stirred, not violently, but deliberately. She closed her eyes. The wind outside quieted. Her breathing slowed. In the space between thoughts, she felt a presence. Not Anakin, not Yoda, not anyone she had known. Just a presence, vast, watching. It did not speak, but its meaning was clear. She was not a Jedi in the way the Order defined. She was something else now. She opened her eyes. No tears, no revelations. Just breathe, steady, grounded. When she stepped outside the temple, night had fallen. The stars above pulsed like quiet signals. She looked up, not for answers, but for rhythm. The galaxy was still out there, still suffering, still uncertain. But she was no longer lost. The Force didn't need temples to speak. But sometimes the silence within them reminded her how to listen. She pulled her cloak close, one hand resting at her side, not near her saber, but over her heart, and she began walking again. The spiral never ended. It only moved inward. Fulcrum did not return with ceremony. No grand message marked her reappearance. She emerged quietly, through channels that never carried names, only intent. Her voice returned to encrypted relays and hidden frequencies. The cells that had gone quiet began to stir. Resistance movements once fractured felt something shift. She had changed, not in purpose but in presence. Her tone was sharper now, focused, refined. The time for small sparks had passed. Now came the time for structure. Ahsoka began to coordinate more than sabotage. She shifted the rebellion from chaos to coherence. Missions no longer acted alone. Resource lines stretched across sectors. Medical caches surfaced on neutral moons. Engineers in hiding repaired stolen starfighters. She rarely met these people face to face. Instead, she offered direction, strategy, timing. Those who listened moved with greater success. Those who didn't still benefited. She asked for no thanks. Her allies took many forms. Former senators working under aliases, bounty hunters with quiet grudges against the Empire, Imperial defectors buried under false identities, pilots from Clone Wars squadrons who kept their flight logs sealed but ready, droids with reprogrammed cores designed to spread false intel. Mon Mothma grew bolder, Bail Organa grew quieter. Both trusted Fulcrum's intel when all else failed. She learned to use the gaps in the Empire's armor, the moments between planetary scans, the schedule lag between shifts, the blind spots left by arrogance. For every world the Empire tightened its grip upon, there was another where their attention wandered. That's where she worked. In the smog-choked streets of Danon, she coordinated the relocation of over 50 families wanted for their past ties to the Jedi. On Vashan, she rerouted a critical shipment of hyperfuel intended for an Imperial fleet, diverting it instead to hidden rebel mechanics. On Lira San, she helped secure a meeting between distant factions of freedom fighters whose leaders had never once spoken face to face. None of these acts were public. They were known only through aftermath. A city where fewer boots marched. A planet where food returned to market shelves. A senator who was saved by a signal that shouldn't have existed. It was in the shadow of these quiet victories that Ahsoka first heard whispers of Thrawn. Not in official reports, he was too careful for that. Not in intercepted transmissions, his movements left no echo. But his influence was unmistakable. Cells that had once operated freely began to vanish. Leaders who followed Fulcrum's instructions found themselves hunted with disturbing precision. Patterns began to shift, and Ahsoka knew it wasn't chance. She studied the reports herself. Every disappearance, every failure. It was not brute force that struck them. It was calculation, anticipation. She recognized the shape of a mind at work, cold, brilliant, and distant. The name came from an old Chiss informant on a neutral colony in wild space. One word, whispered behind closed doors: Thrawn. There was no photograph, no public file. Just quiet fear passed between those who had encountered him and lived long enough to speak. Ahsoka moved her operations deeper underground. Relays were changed twice as often. Fulcrum transmissions were now routed through a rotating string of dead satellites. Code phrases were adjusted weekly, no patterns allowed to settle. And still, the pressure grew. She didn't panic. She adapted. Alliances began to shift, not with bombast, but with shared purpose. The rebellion was no longer just cells scattered in resistance. It was becoming a collective, tied not by proximity, but by values. And Fulcrum held the web together. She trained quiet leaders, not ones who spoke loudly, but ones who listened with care. She reminded them that rebellion was not won through noise, but through precision, through action with meaning. Words came later, when the Empire fell. One of her most trusted contacts operated under the alias Sparrow. Once an Imperial logistics officer, Sparrow defected after witnessing a purge operation against a peaceful monastery. He became Ahsoka's eyes in the mid-rim. Sparrow never asked who Fulcrum was. He just followed the voice that helped him keep his people alive. From Sparrow came knowledge that chilled her. Thrawn wasn't just reacting. He was studying, mapping rebel patterns, analyzing behaviors. He viewed the rebellion not as a threat, but as a structure to dismantle piece by piece. She respected him for that, and feared him. Ahsoka didn't seek confrontation. She sought balance, but balance demanded awareness. And so she learned his methods, how he tested defenses, how he left traps wrapped in generosity, how he punished error not with cruelty, but with consequence. She warned the other leaders, not with panic, with preparation. Thrawn was not Vader. He did not need rage to destroy. He used patience, and Fulcrum would need to be quieter still. She developed a 3-tier relay system for high-level intelligence. Only 2 others knew the full path of the transmission. If any point failed, the data was erased. Messages became shorter, more cryptic. Words turned to symbols, patterns into pauses. Even her voice, once familiar to a few, was now encoded and filtered beyond recognition. Her work became lonelier, but it had to. Each ally she trusted now held only fragments of her design. That way, no capture could undo it. The rebellion was becoming bigger than any one person, bigger than her. And yet, in every movement, every whisper, every supply drop, every rescue mission carried out in silence, her presence remained. Not as a name, not even as Fulcrum, but as coordination, as care, as the unseen hand that made sure they still stood. In a galaxy growing colder by the hour, Ahsoka remained the warmth between shadows. Not by light, but by alignment. Thrawn moved like a storm on the horizon. Not yet arrived, but felt, measured, inevitable. But storms did not stop her. They clarified the path, and Ahsoka moved on. Mandalore was quiet. Not silent, never that, but quiet in the way of broken things trying to hold themselves together. Smoke no longer rose from its cities. The fires had long since faded, but beneath the scorched durasteel and glassed soil, its people still lived, scattered, hardened, changed. Ahsoka returned not with a fleet, not with weapons, but alone. She stepped into the dust of Sundari's ruins with care, boots soft against the fractured earth. The domes above had shattered. Wind howled through exposed corridors. It wasn't just a fallen capital, it was a scar, one still healing. Sabine Wren waited for her at the edge of the plaza. The reunion was brief, no formalities, no long words. They had fought together before, lost together. That built something words didn't reach. Sabine nodded once. Ahsoka answered with a glance. What followed was not a mission, but an alignment of intentions. Mandalore's clans were still splintered. Each bore different wounds, different leaders, different interpretations of honor. Some had been collaborators. Some had resisted until the last blast door fell. Most just wanted to survive. They were proud, but exhausted. Ahsoka knew better than to try to unite them through speech. Instead, she listened. She traveled with Sabine from stronghold to hideout to underground forge. She didn't speak as Jedi. That word held weight here, some of it bitter, some of it confused. She walked as herself, former apprentice, Fulcrum, a witness. Sabine spoke first in most places. Her name still carried some weight, even among those who disagreed with her. But what gave them pause wasn't the name. It was who stood beside her. The quiet woman in the grey cloak. The one who said little but always looked directly at them, without judgment, without fear. In time, they asked questions, not about the rebellion, about purpose, about the war, about the Jedi. Ahsoka answered what she could. What she couldn't, she left open. She never tried to lead the Mandalorians, but she helped them remember they were not broken. Strategic intervention began in whispers. A missing shipment of Beskar reappeared near the Equatorial outpost. A foundling's location, once lost, quietly returned to a clan matriarch without explanation. Dissenting mercenaries known for imperial collaboration found themselves outmaneuvered, not in battle, but economically. Supply routes shifted, credits vanished, trade realigned. Fulcrum had not vanished. She had simply changed masks. Ahsoka coordinated these movements carefully, always through secure relays, always distant. She never offered the rebellion's name, only aid. And through that, loyalty grew. Sabine watched her work with quiet awe. She had always known Ahsoka was more than what the Jedi had allowed her to be. But seeing her now, weaving strategy through trust and patience, it became clear. This wasn't about restoring Mandalore. It was about readiness. Mandalore would rise when it chose to. But until then, someone had to help it breathe again. The alliance between them, Ahsoka and Sabine, strengthened in those shadowed weeks. They moved differently, but they thought in sync. Sabine would handle the symbols, the weapons, the shields. Ahsoka worked behind that shield, ensuring the foundations held. When they sat around low campfires in the old deserts of Kalevala, few words passed. They sharpened weapons, repaired gear, watched the stars. The silences were never uncomfortable. Ahsoka spoke once of Anakin. Not the fall, just the man, the brother, the warmth. Sabine didn't ask for more. In return, Sabine told her of the first time she painted armor, what colors meant to her, why every mark mattered. She never asked for validation. She simply shared. It was respect, grown quietly into trust. One evening, a message reached them, encrypted through 5 systems, relayed through a mining droid on Gorse. It bore news. Thrawn had begun to test the borders of the Outer Rim, not openly, just probes, signals, questions. Ahsoka's expression didn't change, but the air around her stilled. She shared the name with Sabine. The Mandalorian didn't flinch. What do? We prepare. Not through fleets, through connections. Ahsoka met with clan leaders not to demand allegiance, but to inform. She let them choose. No promises, no oaths, just clarity. Some refused, some agreed. Most said nothing and started to mobilize. She worked with the armorer of a surviving covert to ensure comm silence, helped reroute power grids in a hidden Mandalorian facility so it could remain undetected, planted disinformation in systems likely to be scanned by Chiss reconnaissance units. Her movements left no trace, but the effects began to ripple. Hope returned, not in speeches, but in forged armor, in secret drills, in small victories. Beskar, once hoarded, began to pass hands again, not as tribute, but as trust. And beneath every exchange, every act of resistance, one quiet truth emerged. The Mandalorians would never kneel, and Fulcrum would never ask them to. She merely walked beside them, a shadow among warriors, not guiding them, witnessing. And that, somehow, meant more. Sabine painted a small symbol onto her pauldron, an abstract spiral, grey on deep red. No one asked its meaning. No one needed to. It was not allegiance. It was acknowledgement that in the armor of silence sometimes stood something unbreakable. Ahsoka began to dream again. Not fleeting, not shapeless, but sharp dreams, colored by pale stars and foreign skies. Each night brought the same rhythm. A corridor with no walls, a path lit by symbols that pulsed in slow intervals. And always the same voice, distant but familiar. Ezra. He did not speak words. He didn't need to. His presence moved like a current in the Force, not loud but steady. She hadn't heard it since he vanished. No comm signal, no trace. Only the memory of his sacrifice vanishing into hyperspace with Thrawn, carried away by the Purrgil into a place no one could reach. Until now, the Force was shifting again. It never stayed still for long. But this felt different. Not a storm, not a tremor. A call. Ahsoka didn't dismiss it as grief. Grief was familiar. This was something else. A thread being tugged across light years, through time and weight and silence. The kind of pull the Force rarely gave twice. She withdrew from the more visible operations, handed communications to trusted intermediaries. Fulcrum faded again, this time by choice. Her focus turned outward, beyond the known galaxy, toward the stars that lay just beyond reach, where maps ended and speculation began. The name Peridea surfaced quietly, once in the private archive of a Night Sister shrine, again in a distorted transmission from an old Jedi explorer's logs. A star system buried in myth. Most dismissed it as fantasy. Ahsoka did not. She spent nights in quiet meditation, alone on a windswept cliff near the edge of Concordia's outer ridge. The stars shifted slowly overhead, unfamiliar constellations blinking into alignment. She traced the patterns in silence. Ezra was out there, not gone, displaced. And displacement was not the same as death. Sabine joined her in those days, not with questions, but with metal. She repaired Ahsoka's shuttle, recalibrated long-range sensors, and enhanced signal triangulation to track signals that weren't meant to be tracked. They didn't speak of what they hoped, only what needed to be done. The search for Peridea required paths no standard hyperlane could follow. The Purrgil had not left trails in Ion. Their paths were organic, rhythmic, migratory, silent. Ahsoka studied their movements in ancient records, drawn in spirals and cycles rather than grids. Star charts were no help. Instinct would be. At a deep space waypoint near Ord Kios, Ahsoka met with a Thalothian astronavigator who claimed to have seen ghost planets, systems that flickered in and out of real space. He spoke of gravitational folds and resonance shifts. He didn't know he was describing what lay beyond the known galaxy, but she listened carefully. She acquired star whale harmonics from an Ithorian priest who had recorded them for ceremonial use. Not for science, for reverence. The sounds resonated through her hull, low and humming, like something old remembering its path home. Ahsoka knew she was no longer operating in rebellion. This wasn't a war front. It was a search, and every step forward required stillness. One night, aboard her vessel orbiting a barren moon in wild space, she reached again through the Force. She felt Ezra more clearly, not in danger, but surrounded by shadow, the kind that binds quietly, not a prison, a pause. She saw his eyes, not desperate, watching, waiting. Her preparation became ritual, slow, measured. She meditated before each course correction, letting the Force guide her hand rather than data. She ate simply, spoke little, slept with one hand near the nav console, as if she might wake to a signal that hadn't yet reached her ears. Whispers grew in hidden channels. The name Ezra returned in rebel circles. Some claimed he was dead. Others said he had become one with the Force. Ahsoka did not speak. She did not guess. She knew. Sabine painted new marks along her gauntlet, symbols drawn from ancient star-watching tribes. None of them said Ezra, but all of them pointed toward him. Ahsoka read them each morning before sealing her armor. Every clue led further from Republic space, further from conflict, deeper into uncertainty. But not once did she hesitate. The path was not straight. It folded, shifted. Peridea would not be found through coordinates. It would be found through rhythm. And so she listened. To silence. To Ezra's presence, still carried in the Force. to the dreams that were no longer dreams, but messages stitched into light. She adjusted her course again, and the stars blinked in approval. The stars were silent, but not still. They shimmered against the hull of her ship, casting soft reflections across cold metal. Ahsoka stood at the edge of the landing platform, arms crossed, cloak drawn tight. Below her, the desert plains stretched wide and empty. Above, the sky curved into darkness, marked only by a thin crescent moon and the slow drift of constellations unfamiliar to most travelers. This world had been a temporary hold, a place of last preparations, refueling, recalibrating, mapping star patterns that would mean nothing once she crossed beyond the edge. The stars ahead weren't marked by Republic charts. They had no numbered coordinates, only whispers. Peridea waited beyond the veil. She had not spoken the name aloud in days. Words made it smaller. What called to her now wasn't simply a destination. It was motion, a movement in the force that pulled rather than pushed, lightless but sure. Her final message had already been sent, short, encrypted, stripped of emotion. Sabine would understand its meaning even if she didn't say goodbye in person. There was no need. Their bond didn't rely on presence. Trust, once built in silence, didn't fade in absence. Ahsoka turned slowly from the open sky and walked the final steps to the ramp. Her ship was simple, sturdy, stripped of ornament, painted in muted tones, a vessel designed for survival, not declaration. Inside, every panel had been checked twice, systems rerouted for endurance, navigation reconfigured to follow more than math. She would travel by intuition, by instinct, by what the Force revealed in stillness. As the ramp lifted behind her, dust swirled briefly, then settled. There were no goodbyes, no crowd, no ceremony. Ahsoka had not told the wider rebellion. To most, Fulcrum had simply gone dark again, another silence in a long line of silences. It was safer that way. Her departure wasn't rebellion strategy. It was personal. A step toward one voice, one friend, one thread that had never snapped. Ezra still lived, not in certainty, but in presence. She had felt it again that morning, meditating in the shadow of a stone arch carved by wind over centuries. The Force did not give her visions. It gave impressions. A flicker of calm amid chaos, a light drifting beneath unknown stars, not calling for rescue, waiting. The ship's systems hummed around her as she settled into the pilot's seat. The controls glowed softly, stable, responsive. She pressed her palm to the console. Lights pulsed in answer. One breath, then two, then none. Just quiet. She input the coordinates, not the ones from any chart. These came from instinct, from memories of the Purrgil, from sound echoes mapped against silence, from constellations glimpsed between galactic drift. The trajectory was untested, risky, indefinite. But she did not waver. Outside, the desert faded. The sky shifted. Engines thrummed low, steady. The stars ahead shimmered faintly. Then they warped. The ship vanished in a blur of motion, fast, clean, unannounced. No signal followed, no signature left behind, only the fading of light against the backdrop of infinite black. In the ship's narrow cabin, Ahsoka sat still. She was not afraid. She had shed fear years ago, not because she no longer faced danger, but because she had made peace with uncertainty. What lay ahead could not be measured. It wasn't exploration. It wasn't escape. It was alignment. Every step that had led her here, Malachor, the world between worlds, the temple carved into stone, the rebellion shaped from whispers, had prepared her for this. Ezra had given himself without hesitation. Now she would do the same, not to retrieve him, not to fix the past, but to walk the path she had been led to. No Jedi code required it, no title demanded it, just the Force and her. The stars outside changed shape. Her ship moved into currents unknown, guided by motion older than hyperspace. This was not the galaxy of maps and politics. It was the galaxy of myth, of beginnings, of lost things. The console dimmed as it entered passive mode. She closed her eyes and let silence fill her senses. Somewhere ahead, Ezra waited. Not in stasis, in solitude. And she was coming, not as a rescuer, as a witness. Her silhouette remained still against the soft interior glow, framed by the curve of starlight around her. And then even that light faded, swallowed into the endless dark between galaxies. The stars here were wrong, too close, too distant, too old. When Ezra Bridger awoke, the Purrgil were already gone, silent silhouettes that had carried him across the edge of known space. He lay in a field of slate-colored grass beneath a pale, oversized moon. Wind whispered across his face. He did not know the world's name yet. He would learn it later. Peridea. For now, there was only breath, pain, hunger. He stood slowly, body stiff from the jump. The Force moved through him like water beneath ice, there, but slowed. He reached out, not for rescue, for orientation. But what greeted him was silence. No familiar signatures, no bright sparks of life he recognized. The Force was present, but distant. It listened. It didn't answer. Ezra was alone. The first days blurred. He moved without direction, guided only by instinct. He foraged what little he could. The planet's flora was strange, thin-stemmed plants with bitter bulbs, roots that glowed faintly in the dark. He drank dew off curved leaves. Shelter came from caves that breathed with heat from underground springs. Sleep came in short intervals. He kept his lightsaber hidden, not out of fear, but because it no longer defined him. The galaxy he knew was gone. The battle he had chosen was finished. Survival required something quieter than strength. Time passed uncounted. Ezra watched the moons shift across the sky, two of them locked in a strange, patient dance. At night, he heard distant calls from creatures that never approached. Sometimes he felt the weight of eyes, but never saw who watched. Then came the stone towers, half-buried structures rising like broken fingers from hills of black sand. He found one while tracking a stream. The entrance was carved with symbols, spirals, circles, star maps etched in languages he did not know. Inside, warmth, light, fire pits that still held embers. He was not the first to find it. He would not be the last. He wasn't alone after all. They came slowly, wary, thin, robed figures with eyes like smoke and skin the color of dried roots. They did not speak basic. Their words flowed like water over stone, ancient and careful. He bowed his head. He made no gestures of power. They offered food, and he accepted. They offered silence, and he honored it. This was not a culture of haste. Ezra stayed near their settlement for months. He helped gather herbs, repair stonework, track the weather patterns that shaped their harvests. He asked few questions. He observed. They watched him back, not with suspicion, but with patience, as if waiting to see what kind of stranger he would become. Eventually, they showed him the archive. A hollowed cliffside filled with scrolls and etched tablets. Not digital, not fragile. Knowledge passed hand to hand for generations, scratched into stone and bark and hide. Some depicted stories of visitors from other galaxies, sky beasts with glowing eyes, storms that folded space. He saw his own arrival hinted in crude sketches, drawings that had been made before he arrived. Prophecy, maybe, or memory. The word Jedi was never spoken, but he saw its shape in their legends. He asked about the towers. They said they had stood since before their moons were born. They were markers, not monuments, aligned with movements in the sky, tuned to rhythms of energy. The Force existed here, but it had been named differently. They called it the breath, a rhythm, a pulse, a song that connected all movement. Ezra listened. His training had taught him how to fight. His exile taught him how to listen. Over time, his strength returned, not as power, but as presence. His connection to the Force didn't roar. It hummed. It settled into him like a deep vibration, layered beneath thought and breath. He no longer sought visions. He waited for them. One night, under a sky streaked with falling stars, he had a dream. Not of home. Of Ahsoka. She stood at the edge of a great current, wrapped in grey, her eyes closed, hands open. She said nothing, but she looked toward him, not in warning, in readiness. He awoke with his heart steady. She was coming. He did not know how. He only knew she had found the current, the same one that had brought him here. He walked that morning to the highest ridge above the settlement. The sun rose slow and wide. He closed his eyes and let the Force move through him, not guiding it, joining it. He didn't prepare for rescue. He prepared for return, not to the galaxy that was, but to the one waiting to be shaped. The people of Peridea did not try to keep him. They had taught him what they could. He had given them what little he offered in return. A quiet balance. He carved a mark into the base of the tower, a spiral set within a crescent. A memory, not a claim. And he waited. The land beyond the settlement changed. It grew older. Ezra followed the edge of the river until the trees thinned into stone. Hills rolled outward, smooth and pale like sleeping giants. On the third day, he found the first structure, half buried in moss, shaped like a ribcage turned to stone. At first glance, it appeared natural, the wind having sculpted it over time. But beneath the weathered surface, patterns emerged. Etchings, geometry too precise for accident. He stepped inside and felt the air shift. It wasn't cold. It was still, as though the structure held its breath. A central chamber opened before him. No doors, no throne, no shrine. Only pillars arranged in a spiral, each one hollowed at the top, as if meant to carry sound. He sat in the middle, cross-legged on the smooth stone floor, and waited. For hours nothing came. No vision, no presence. Just the soft sound of wind threading through the hollow pillars. But slowly, he noticed something. Tones rising and falling in cycles. The Force wasn't just present here, it was singing. The melody wasn't constant. It shifted based on breath, on thought, on emotion. If he held too tightly to an idea, the tones flattened. If he let his thoughts wander, they harmonized. The chamber didn't respond to power. It responded to balance. This was not Jedi training. It was older. He spent the night in the temple. When he woke, the patterns in the stone had changed, not dramatically, just enough, a slight realignment. He understood. This place listened, and it remembered. He marked it in his mind as the first. In the following weeks, he found others. One temple stood open to the sky, with concentric rings carved into the earth, each step lower humming faintly when walked upon in the correct order. Another, hidden in the canyon walls, held a central monolith that pulsed with light only when touched during certain phases of the moons. These were not tests. They were invitations. Ezra accepted them quietly. He stopped thinking of the Force as instruction. It became rhythm, not learned, but felt. He began to move differently, not with the formality of the Jedi katas, but with fluid responses to the environment, using the wind's pressure to shift his stance, adjusting his step to the flow of underground vibration. He did not seek to master these places. He let them shape his awareness. In one ruin, beneath a canopy of glowing crystals, he encountered inscriptions that spoke of echo paths, moments in time where decision and presence created reflection across realities. Not alternate timelines, echoes, ripples that sang back when called upon with intention. He didn't fully understand, but the idea stayed with him. He stopped carrying his lightsaber. It remained in his pack, wrapped in cloth. He found he no longer reached for it. Not out of fear, not from weakness, but because confrontation no longer felt necessary. Defense had become something else: space, breath, timing. One evening he entered a ruined sanctuary nestled at the edge of a salt flat. Its ceiling had long since collapsed, but the walls still stood, etched with spiraling star patterns. In the center stood a pedestal. On it, a stone bowl filled with ash. He reached into the ash and pulled out a single shard of bone, polished, engraved, warm to the touch. No inscription, just weight. That night, he dreamed again. Not of the past, of motion. Ahsoka, distant, but closer now. Her presence clearer. He felt no urgency, only convergence. The people of Peridea had no word for Jedi, but they had a word for those who listened. Sithari. Not a name of power, a name of stillness. The one who waits until the land speaks back. A title without rank, offered only when earned through silence. An elder placed a necklace around his wrist the morning after he returned from the salt flat. A gesture, not a ceremony. Ezra nodded once and said nothing. His time was drawing near. The world was giving him space, not pushing him forward. That was how he knew it was almost time to leave. The Force no longer whispered. It stood beside him. He had gone beyond lessons. He had entered understanding. And Peridea, in return, remained quiet. It had given him what it could. The rest would come from elsewhere. Ezra stood at the edge of a ravine, staring down at the hull of an Imperial transport, half swallowed by stone and silence. Its panels were intact, too intact. No scorch marks from a crash, no broken wings or burn trails. It had been landed, purposefully, hidden, and recently. The wind shifted. The Force tensed around him. He had not seen Thrawn in years, not since the sacrifice that tore them both from Lothal's orbit. But this was a signature he recognized, not in the structure of the ship, but in the arrangement of its concealment. Efficient, measured, calculated. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect. He was not the only ghost stranded on this world. He circled the canyon without descending. He didn't need to see more. The pattern was enough. Thrawn was here, still alive, still planning. Ezra pulled back from the ridge and vanished into the trees. There were no direct encounters, no skirmishes, just shadows. Tracks erased and replaced. Camps disturbed. Communication attempts intercepted but never replied to. The chessboard had been set silently. Neither side made a move without knowing the other was already watching. Ezra began to observe the landscape differently. Ruins that had been untouched were now disturbed. Old temples had new markings, patterns too sharp for the locals. A single piece of painted cloth left in the hollow of a boulder, Chiss symbols scrawled with careful brushwork. Not a message, a warning. I'm here. Thrawn had always relied on more than brute force. He saw culture as code, art as strategy, and even here in the unknown regions that method hadn't changed. Ezra adapted. He moved camps weekly, altered his travel rhythms, kept tools spread across regions. He stopped lighting fires. He used no digital signals. The Force became his only guide. Each meditation sharpened, each step measured. Thrawn, it seemed, had managed to secure some form of power, even here. A fractured detachment of stormtroopers was sighted once from a distance, helmets cracked, armor repainted with strange patterns that bore no Imperial emblem. Their formation was intact. Discipline hadn't faded. Ezra didn't engage. He studied. The game had become quiet. No confrontation. No open war. But pressure. Ezra helped local villagers disappear when Thrawn's scouts approached. He redirected the attention of wandering patrols with decoy trails, fake settlements, abandoned relics that told the wrong story. He didn't need to win. He needed to delay. Each move brought memory of Lothal, of the way Thrawn had anticipated every turn before it was made. Ezra had been lucky then, desperate, willing to gamble his life to remove a threat no one else could contain. But now the stakes were different. Now it wasn't just escape. It was preservation. Thrawn was rebuilding, not rapidly, carefully. Ezra learned to read that caution for what it was. Intent. Every supply cache uncovered had been placed with purpose. Weapons sealed in rock vaults. Droids reprogrammed and buried beneath old relay towers. Maps scrawled on animal hide, drawn in lines that traced no modern sector, but matched Peridea's hidden systems. Thrawn wasn't just surviving, he was preparing. Ezra adjusted. He began marking hidden warning stones at the edges of known paths, symbols borrowed from Peridean tradition. Silent messages only the villagers would understand. He trained scouts to recognize signs of approaching forces, taught them to disappear between root and rock. Resistance here could not look like rebellion. It had to be subtle, invisible, temporary. Sometimes he wondered if Thrawn knew he was being tracked. More likely, he welcomed it. Ezra's advantage wasn't strength, it was awareness. He stopped asking how long he had been here. Days and seasons blurred, but the weight of each decision grew heavier. The need to stay vigilant became constant, not exhausting, just necessary. He couldn't afford to rest. The temples he once meditated in grew quieter, their pull diminished. Not because the Force had faded, but because a new current had entered the landscape, one bent toward order, not harmony. He felt it every time the moonlight caught glinting armor in the trees, every time silence broke too cleanly to be natural. Thrawn never chased. He waited. Ezra realized the threat wasn't an ambush. It was erosion of hope, of timing, of clarity. He walked slower now, but with precision. He stopped leaving signs of his presence. Even the locals were told not to mention him when strangers passed. They began referring to him as a wind spirit, a myth. He allowed it. It was safer that way. There were nights he felt Thrawn's gaze. Not literal, not physical, but intellectual. As if the Grand Admiral was always one step behind, never rushing, always learning. Ezra accepted the truth. He would not have peace here. Not until something shifted. Not until someone came. Until then, he would move like shadow. Patient, deliberate, awake. The sky above Peridea changed during the long silences. Moons shifted, stars appeared and vanished in patterns not charted by any known map. Ezra noticed this most during his meditations, those hours when breath slowed and thought dissolved into quiet awareness. One night, far from the reach of Thrawn's watchers, Ezra sat on the peak of a cliff where the air turned thin and cold. He had come here before, but never stayed long. This time he remained. The Force was stirring differently, not in warning, in rhythm, a pulse older than the ground beneath him. He closed his eyes and reached out, not in search, but in stillness. He wasn't calling. He was listening. At first, the Force felt wide and empty, stretched across starlight and silence. Then faintly, something moved through the dark. Not thought, not language. A presence both massive and gentle, weightless and eternal. It moved like song, carried on cosmic tides, older than Jedi archives and untouched by war. The Purrgil. Ezra didn't call them. They weren't coming. They were simply near. Not near in distance, near in connection. Their essence flowed through hyperspace itself, beings shaped by the same currents the Jedi called the Force, though the Purrgil had no need to name it. They moved through it, became it, without control or doctrine. They followed stars that hadn't been born yet, traveled to places that had never been mapped. They didn't teach, but they revealed. Ezra remained still for hours, maybe longer. Time felt stretched here, woven into the pulse of breath and motion. The deeper he listened, the more he understood, not in words, but in impressions. The Purrgil did not think of paths as beginnings or ends. To them, movement was existence. The choice to shift from one galaxy to another wasn't travel, it was continuity. They did not mourn those left behind, nor did they forget. They carried echoes with them. Every leap was layered with memory. Every trail left behind was meant to be followed only by those willing to move without answers. Ezra saw flashes, his younger self aboard the Purrgil's back, eyes wide, heart steady. The flash of light as Lothal faded, Thrawn's rage, the Purrgil's calm. The memory wasn't painful. It had settled into him long ago, a decision made and accepted. But now he saw it differently. It hadn't been escape, it had been placement. The Force had aligned his motion with theirs, sent him not to exile, but to pause. Because the journey wasn't meant to end with Thrawn's disappearance. It was meant to continue when the stars aligned once more. The Force, through the Purrgil, offered no instruction, only presence. Ezra sat with them in that timeless space, learning through feeling, understanding sacrifice not as loss, but as transition. Every choice echoed forward. Every movement made space for another. When he opened his eyes, the night had shifted. A warm wind passed through the trees below, and the sky above shimmered faintly. A line of stars now blinked in a gentle arc. Familiar, but different. A reminder. The Purrgil was still moving, and someday, when the moment was right, so would he. Ezra rose from the stone, breathing steadily. He wasn't waiting, he was preparing. The wind guided him toward the cliffs. Ezra felt it long before he saw it. An energy hidden beneath stone and silence, not powerful in the way of battle, subtle, resting, a quiet hum beneath the dust. It was buried behind a series of narrow passageways, where the earth had cracked from centuries of pressure and time. He pressed forward through the shadows, letting instinct lead him deeper. There, tucked between slabs of rock and layers of moss, was the door. No lights, no symbols, just a wall that didn't feel natural. The Force clung to it, gentle and persistent, like breath waiting to be acknowledged. Ezra placed his hand against the surface. It yielded not with resistance, but with recognition. The stone shifted aside. The chamber beyond was untouched. It held no throne, no grand chamber of judgment, just a single circular space, and along its curved walls, scripts, written by hand, not basic, but older, Jedi glyphs, weathered, but legible. He stepped forward slowly. A part of him had expected this. Not exactly here, not exactly now, but somewhere. The Jedi had traveled far, even into regions forgotten by the Republic. They didn't always announce themselves. Some orders split from the core long before the archives were compiled. This place, this sanctuary, felt like it had been left behind by one of those orders. Not abandoned, preserved. In the center of the room stood a low altar. On it, a single stone tablet. He brushed away dust and read. The message wasn't long. It spoke of balance, not as a goal, but as a rhythm, of how the Force was not something to be controlled, but harmonized with. How light and dark were not opposites, but twins, bound, reactive, inseparable. Ezra sat cross-legged and breathed. His training with Kanan had taught him to resist the dark, to choose the light. But here the idea was gentler. The Force wasn't asking him to choose a side. It was asking him to listen, to move in awareness, to respond, not control, to live through alignment. He stayed there for days. The chamber was quiet, but not silent. It offered small things, a moment of insight, a change in light, a deeper breath. The longer he sat, the more the walls began to make sense. Some inscriptions taught movement. Others described meditation techniques long lost to temple teachings. One series explained how to shift emotional weight into grounding breath, how fear could be acknowledged and released without judgment. He practiced each one, slowly, without expectation. His lightsaber remained on his belt untouched. He began to integrate what he learned into his walks, into his silence, into the long pauses between Thrawn's shadow and the Force's stillness. He no longer trained in defense or offense. He trained in perception, in staying open, in knowing when not to act. This wasn't the Jedi Order he had known. It wasn't an order at all. It was a memory, a rhythm. And he was part of it now, not by title, but by choice. He was not Jedi in the traditional sense, but the Force moved through him still. And that was enough. A quiet rebirth had begun, not of temples, not of rules, but of awareness. Something the galaxy would one day need again. The villages were scattered across the northern valleys, their homes carved from thick roots and ancient stone. Ezra approached them without warning, carrying no weapon in hand, no banner to explain his presence. He came alone. He came quietly. The first elders watched from a distance. No greeting, no threat, just eyes. Ezra waited, offered help with repairs, mended tools, taught a child how to coax fire from damp moss, using only patience and friction. He did not speak of Thrawn. He didn't need to. The fear already lived in their silence. The locals called them night hands, Thrawn's operatives, soldiers who moved like shadows across the plains, cloaked in the Empire's forgotten pride, bearing weapons too advanced for a land so rooted in simplicity. They did not conquer openly. They manipulated through trade, isolated villages from one another, poisoned rivers of trust with whispers and control. Ezra listened. He learned which paths were safe, which elders knew how to send messages without leaving words. The people here did not build alliances through declarations. They relied on presence. A stranger who helped was remembered. A stranger who returned was trusted. Over weeks, small circles began to form. Ezra taught them what he could, how to read the movement of scouts from tracks too clean to be natural, how to listen for energy disturbances when old Imperial tech activated underground, how to blend movement with terrain to vanish before being noticed. He never asked them to fight. He asked them to survive with awareness. Some called him the Star Walker. Others whispered a different name, Senthari, the Ghost Child. He never corrected them. These names weren't titles. They were signals, markers of presence, passed between villages without sound. When he visited again, more eyes met his. Fires were shared. Questions began to surface. Not of who he was, but how to endure what was coming. Because Thrawn had noticed. The Grand Admiral never reacted in haste. His answers came through absence. Ezra found burnt gardens in places that once welcomed him, fishing nets torn, food stores ransacked, not stolen, just spoiled enough to breed fear. No direct message, just erosion. Ezra understood this game. He changed his movements, never stayed more than 2 nights in the same place. He left signs only villagers would understand, a knot tied backwards, a stone turned deliberately in a stream. He moved like wind between trees, never seen long enough to be traced. But word still spread. People from farther villages began arriving at the edges of gatherings. Some carried gifts, old tools, carved tokens, songs passed down in code. They weren't pledging allegiance. They were joining a rhythm, one they hadn't known they were waiting for. Ezra watched their courage unfold slowly, not in rebellion, in resilience. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. One night, a scout brought news. Thrawn's men were relocating one of the larger villages under the pretense of protection. But it wasn't protection. It was control. Ezra moved before the procession could begin. He intercepted the path under cover of low mist, placed false warnings of rot and unstable terrain along their route, rerouted them into the forest where traps had been set. Not lethal, just inconvenient. The next morning, the convoy had retreated. No battle, just delay. Resistance without confrontation. The elders didn't celebrate. They acknowledged. They placed a new stone near the central flame, painted with 3 concentric lines. It marked an agreement, unspoken but permanent. Ezra was no longer a visitor. He was part of the survival. Thrawn's presence remained, watchful, calculating. But Ezra didn't fight it. He moved through it, shaped his allies like water pressing against stone, gently, persistently, without needing to break it. The villages endured. Their strength grew through silence, and in that silence, hope took root. The wind carried her name before the force did. Ezra had grown used to silence. It had become his companion, his shield. But lately that silence felt thinner. He noticed it first during meditation. Small tremors in the stillness. Moments where the force shifted like distant ripples reaching across endless stars. No alarm, no urgency, just presence. He sat in the same hollow grove each morning where the light filtered through twisted branches and scattered across the soil in quiet patterns. There, without reaching, he began to feel her. Ahsoka, not as a memory, as motion. It came slowly, not through dreams but through breath. A current of awareness brushing his thoughts. Ezra opened himself to it gently. He didn't chase the connection. He allowed it to bloom. And it did. At first, faint images surfaced. Her silhouette in fog, her voice layered beneath wind. Then more clarity. The weight of her footsteps on cold stone. The pull of her will, steady and searching. She wasn't calling him directly. But the force threaded them together across distance, woven from shared experience and mutual resolve. He knew then. She was coming. Ezra didn't leap to his feet. He didn't run to signal towers or alert the villages. He returned to his breath, steady and focused. Excitement flickered at the edges, but he anchored it in discipline. Too much had changed to welcome hope recklessly. He wasn't the same boy who vanished from Lothal, and she too had walked many paths. Still, her presence brought a weight Ezra hadn't felt in years, a quiet assurance. She hadn't forgotten him. She'd kept searching, through shadows, through war, through exile. Ezra rose from the grove and began to prepare, not for battle, not for escape, for alignment. He moved through the valleys again, visiting allies, not to rally them, just to listen, to remind them of calm before the wave. He helped where he could, repaired boundary sensors, delivered tools, reinforced safe houses. He spoke little. He smiled when they asked if he was waiting for something. They already knew the answer. At night, the bond grew stronger. Ezra could sense her closer now, not arriving, approaching. The force between them pulsed like shared breath, slow, patient, grounded. He sat under the stars more often, watched the skies the Purrgil once danced through. His heart stayed quiet. No desperate longing, just readiness, the kind that grows in silence and sharpens over time. Ezra did not know when she would arrive, but he knew she would, and that was enough. The night was still. Peridea's sky shimmered in silence, stars strung low across the horizon. Cool winds moved through the tall grass, whispering over stone and soil. Ezra stood at the edge of a ridge, his eyes fixed on the space between constellations, where her presence now lingered, clearer than ever. He had felt her land. She didn't call for him. She didn't need to. He followed the pull without hesitation, moving beneath the trees, past old stone markers and familiar routes. Every step was quiet, not rushed. The force stretched between them, anchored by memory and trust. When he reached the clearing, he stopped. Ahsoka stood there, facing the stars. Her cloak drifted gently in the wind. She didn't turn at first. She didn't need to. The silence spoke first, thick with everything unspoken. Time hadn't faded the connection. It had deepened it, quietly, patiently. When she finally looked over her shoulder, the calm in her eyes met the calm in his. No words came right away. They weren't needed. Just breathe. Just presence. Ezra stepped closer, and Ahsoka moved to meet him halfway. Their embrace was soft, nothing forceful, nothing dramatic. Just the quiet contact of two souls shaped by years apart and the weight of everything they'd carried alone. The force rippled gently around them, steady and warm. They sat by the fire Ezra built from memory, dry moss, broken twigs, a spark drawn from stone. No lightsabers were present, no battle plans laid out, just firelight and starlight. Ahsoka listened as Ezra spoke, slowly, recounting years in fragments. Not all details, only those that mattered. She offered no judgment, only recognition. Then it was her turn. She told him of the galaxy's slow unraveling, of the Empire's fall, of the fragments still clinging to power, of Fulcrum's shadows, of how the Force had led her farther from doctrine and deeper into purpose. They didn't talk strategy yet. First came silence, then laughter, low and brief, then longer, not from humor, but from relief. Later, they walked the edge of a canyon. Ezra showed her the stone carvings etched by the villagers, markers of stories and seasons. Ahsoka touched each one gently, reverently. She didn't speak of legacy, but her presence honored it. When they finally sat to talk of Thrawn, their voices dropped to whispers. Not out of fear, out of focus. Ezra had been watching, learning. Ahsoka had come seeking, not just rescue, but resolution. Their strategies took shape without raising volume. Names passed between them softly, coordinates memorized, paths marked, weak points noted. They would not charge. They would move like the wind. Ezra looked to the sky again, now joined by someone who understood, someone who remembered. Ahsoka met his gaze. Neither spoke of destiny, but they both knew it had arrived. In the quietest hours before dawn, the final act began to unfold. A pale mist settled across the plains of Peridea, obscuring valleys and ruins like gentle hands shielding something fragile. But this gentleness was deceptive. Behind the veil of silence, an ancient patience stirred, one that had been watching, calculating, quietly laying foundations for an inevitable departure. Thrawn had never hurried. He had never needed to. In the years marooned beyond the edge of the known galaxy, he had built slowly, methodically, turning a predicament into opportunity. His shadow operations, invisible networks, and hidden contingencies had patiently accumulated strength until they became impossible to ignore. Ezra and Ahsoka had both felt it, the tightening of threads around the planet. The energy was subtle, yet distinct, a strategic mind moving carefully, always just beyond sight. It became clearer with every disrupted village, every abandoned relic, every carefully erased trail. Thrawn's departure was no longer a distant fear. It had become an imminent certainty. Ezra stood at the crest of a ridge overlooking one of Thrawn's staging areas. He was alone, watching quietly, concealed in the shadow of twisted trees. Below, uniformed figures moved with mechanical precision, loading strange containers onto transports. Their armor was worn but disciplined. They moved with a focused rhythm. Soldiers prepared for something beyond mere survival. These weren't typical Imperial troops anymore. They'd adapted, changed. Their armor bore unfamiliar marks, symbols Thrawn had designed to forge unity in exile. Ezra knew each sign held meaning. They weren't decorations. They were a language, a code only Thrawn fully understood. Ezra observed the activity without emotion, absorbing the information carefully. The pattern was clear. Thrawn was preparing to leave, his resources finally sufficient. A sense of calm determination filled Ezra, not rage, not panic, just clarity. He understood the stakes now. He always had. But seeing the evidence sharpened his focus. Thrawn intended not simply to escape, but to reshape the galaxy he had once nearly controlled. Returning quietly to their hidden camp, Ezra found Ahsoka waiting. She sensed his approach before he emerged from the shadows, her eyes opening slowly, reflecting the dim firelight. There was no surprise on her face, only quiet acknowledgement. "It's happening," Ezra said softly, voice barely disturbing the night's stillness. Ahsoka nodded once, slowly. "I felt it too. The plans he laid, subtle, meticulous. They're almost complete." Ezra sat beside her. Their silence lingered briefly, heavy with meaning. They had no need to debate what must come next. Each had been shaped by solitude, tempered by years of vigilance. Their paths, once separate, now aligned quietly and irrevocably. "We can't stop him from leaving," Ezra finally said, gently accepting the reality. "But we can prepare." "Yes," Ahsoka agreed calmly. "His return will threaten everything. The galaxy isn't ready." Ezra traced circles in the dirt, thoughtful. "But we can be." The night stretched quietly around them. Stars pulsed faintly through drifting clouds. Neither spoke for some time. They didn't need to. Each understood what lay ahead. They shared a bond deeper than words, a resonance built through isolation, loss, and the quiet strength found in survival. In silence they planned, no grand declarations, no battle cries. Their preparations were subtle, weapons tuned carefully, supplies sorted precisely, allies quietly contacted, instructions given gently, calmly. Villages were warned discreetly, routes marked, safe houses reinforced. They moved like shadows, always mindful of Thrawn's watchful gaze. Across the distant valleys, Thrawn also moved quietly, finalizing his departure with silent precision. He did not waste resources on meaningless destruction, yet his leaving brought quiet devastation. He had subtly dismantled infrastructure, leaving the locals vulnerable. His preparations had quietly drained resources and fractured trust among villagers. Thrawn's legacy here would be scars beneath the surface, not craters or burned cities. Ahsoka and Ezra stood side by side at dawn, watching from afar as Thrawn's transports ascended silently into the pale sky. They felt no urge to strike prematurely. They were patient, knowing confrontation would come soon enough. As the last ships vanished above the clouds, Ezra felt the planet breathe differently. A slow exhale of relief mingled with quiet grief. Thrawn had left, but his departure was not a victory. It was simply another step in a longer journey. Ezra knew this wasn't the end of Thrawn's Gambit. It was merely its beginning. He glanced at Ahsoka, whose expression remained serene despite the gravity of the moment. "He'll return stronger." She met his gaze calmly. "Then we'll be ready." There were no promises of triumph, no easy assurances. They faced the truth quietly, understanding that the coming struggle would demand everything. Neither Jedi nor soldier fully, they would need to become something more, something adaptable, something resilient. The galaxy required no heroes, just steady souls willing to stand quietly in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. Ezra turned back toward the horizon, breathing deeply. The planet around them lay quietly wounded, yet resilient. Thrawn's Gambit had left invisible scars, but scars healed with time and intention. Peridea would recover, slowly, quietly, and so would they. The future stretched ahead, uncertain yet clear in its necessity. Ezra felt the Force moving steadily through them, whispering gently that their paths had intertwined not by chance, but through quiet destiny. They stood quietly together, prepared to face whatever waited beyond the stars.